Sri Lanka is witnessing an unprecedented economic crisis, so much so that people have taken to the streets and are protesting against Gotabaya Rajapaksha, the president of Sri Lanka, for his economic policies. There is a shortage of food, fuel. People are standing in queues for hours to get a gas cylinder, to get petrol and diesel. So much so that you have army deployed at petrol stations in Sri Lanka in order to ensure that there is no violence at petrol pumps. In fact, so dire is the situation in Sri Lanka that school exams have been cancelled because of lack of paper. Think about it. A country has run out of paper. And a country that has run out of paper is definitely in a serious economic crisis. So how did Sri Lanka reach here? What are the factors that led to this economic crisis? In this video, I'll try and decode these questions and tell you how Sri Lanka exactly arrived here. Now, there are two key factors to understand the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. One of them is that Sri Lanka is a hugely tourism dependent economy. The island nation gets most of its revenues and foreign exchange reserves from this tourism. Now, tourism as an industry, as a sector, was badly hit because of the 2 years of COVID-19 pandemic starting 2020. But even before the COVID-19 pandemic, you had Easter terror attacks in Sri Lanka, which also crippled Sri Lanka's tourism. So 3 years of damage to its tourism has broken the back of Sri Lankan economy. Foreign exchange reserves in Sri Lanka have declined by $70 billion over the last 2 years. And as a result, Sri Lanka simply has run out of money to pay for essential imports like food, fuel, etc. The second is that Sri Lanka currently is sitting on massive amount of debt. Estimates suggest that close to 110 to 125% of GDP is the figure of debt in Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka owes most of this debt to countries like India, China, Japan, and institutions like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. Successive governments, whether it was Maithripala Sirisena or Gotabaya Rajapaksha currently, they have borrowed indiscriminately from global institutions and from countries like China, which has made it very difficult for them to repay these loans. Global credit rating agencies like Fitch, Moody's, Standard & Poor, they have downgraded Sri Lanka, and now they are finding it very difficult to repay these loans. Now, government policies or Rajapaksa government's policies are also responsible for this economic mess. In early 2019, Gotabaya Rajapaksha announced an overnight switch to organic farming. And as a result, pesticides, all kinds of artificial fertilizers, pesticides, weedicides were banned in Sri Lanka, and farmers urged to switch to organic farming. Now, this affected food production in Sri Lanka, and food production slipped to several decades low in Sri Lanka because of this policy. Secondly, the government also announced deep income tax cuts, and while that gave relief to ordinary Sri Lankans, the government tax revenues were badly hit at a time when it was finding it very difficult to earn revenues from tourism and other sectors. Plus, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on export-based industries like tea, garments, and spices. These sectors were badly affected in Sri Lanka, and the war in Ukraine has made these sectors and the demand for products from these sectors all the more lesser. So all these factors combined have pushed Sri Lanka towards an economic crisis where it is finding really difficult to produce the money to pay for these essential imports, and as a result, ordinary Sri Lankans today find themselves in a mess that is unprecedented. Sri Lanka has now finally approached the IMF for a bailout, and one hopes that the island nation of Sri Lanka, our neighbor, will come out of this economic mess at the earliest, because it is not in India's favor to see Sri Lanka go down like this. Remember, any crisis in Sri Lanka sends a lot of refugees to India, especially to states like Tamil Nadu, and therefore it is in India's interest that our neighbor comes out of this economic mess at the earliest. In fact, India has reached out with a lot of help to Sri Lanka, and these are basically the reasons why Sri Lanka is where it is today.